I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. The bells at Magdalen have always struck me with a faint cruelty. They mark the hours so faithfully that one cannot avoid the recognition of time spent, wasted or drowned in whiskey. That particular morning, a morning I remember more for its air of tentative light than anything else, I sat in the Jaguar with the windows lowered, letting the cold creep in. The Cherwell was sluggish beside me, brown water gliding under the bridge where rowers had yet to disturb it. I had left the crossword unfinished on the passenger seat, a single 7-letter clue circled in black ink, unanswered. There is something unsettling about the incompleteness of a puzzle. It stares back like a question that refuses kindness. The bells began clear at first, then muddied by distance and memory. I watched a pair of undergraduates cycle past, gowns streaming behind them, in the absurd dignity Oxford insists upon, even in drizzle. Their laughter drifted into the mist, momentary like a cigarette flame extinguished too quickly. I told myself I was only idling, that I had nowhere in particular to be, but that was not entirely true. The paper folded beside me gave me away. I had read the headline half a dozen times already. College fellow found dead in her rooms. A name, Helena Forsyth, printed with the dignity of italics. It is remarkable how a death becomes less shocking once set in type. The letters flatten it, remove the flesh. I should have ignored it. After all, plenty die within those medieval walls. Heart attacks, quiet despair, the odd road accident after too much port. And yet I did not ignore it. Something in the phrasing of the article caught my attention. The word accident had been used with the kind of reserve that begged to be doubted. Lewis would later tell me I was looking for trouble, but he forgets that trouble is the only thing that ever keeps me alive. The bells finished their sermon. Silence resumed, save for the faint slap of water against the banks. I lit a cigarette, though I had promised myself I would not. Promises are like half-solved crosswords, untidy, unsatisfactory. The smoke lingered about the car like a half-formed thought. I remember thinking of an aria then, though I cannot recall which. Something Verdi, perhaps, a woman's voice breaking on a note it could not quite sustain. The sound of failure rendered beautiful. I wound the window further, not to let in air, but to let the past slip more easily beside me. Eventually I drove towards the city, the Jaguar protesting as it always did in the lower gears. St. Giles was already crowded with buses. A knot of tourists stared up at Balliol, as if a Latin inscription would disclose its meaning only to them. I envied their certainty, their easy faith in surfaces. At the traffic lights I glanced again at the crossword. 7 letters, the clue lingering. Etched in glass, the truth survives. I muttered possible answers aloud, none fitting, all unsatisfying. The lights changed. I eased the car on. Somewhere deep within I recognized that clue would not leave me. Like a bell, it had already marked its hour, and all else would follow. I reached the precincts of St. Etheldreda's just as the porter was unlocking the side gate. He looked up with the weary familiarity of a man who has seen too many uniforms, too many intrusions. I raised a hand, an awkward gesture that pretended at politeness. It was not yet certain why I was there. Officially nothing required my presence. Unofficially everything did. I wanted to see the corridor where she had been found, the study with its stained glass window, the shards of a decanter still sharp on the floorboards. But most of all I wanted to hear the silence left behind by her absence. Silence can tell more than testimony. As I walked through the arch into the quad, the stones glistened with the memory of rain. Pigeons scattered from the cloistered roof, their wings echoing like soft applause. I paused under the shadow of the chapel, tracing with my eyes the coloured panes above. A phrase etched there caught me unawares. A Latin line, familiar yet off-key like an aria missung. I repeated it inwardly, tasting the wrongness. Later I would understand why it clung to me, but at that moment it was nothing more than a faint itch of unease. Lewis telephoned as I stood there. His voice, always too practical, cut through the hush. He spoke of routine, of paperwork, of the preliminary report. I heard him without listening. My eyes remained on that glass, the misquoted line shimmering with the morning's light. When the call ended, I slipped the crossword into my coat pocket. The bells had ceased long ago, yet their echo persisted in the back of my skull. I walked slowly towards the rooms where Helena Forsyth had died, my steps deliberate, almost ceremonial. Even then, before I had asked a single question, before I had seen the body or the fragments of glass, I felt it, the unsettled certainty that death, like truth, rarely arrives by accident. The corridor of St. Etheldreda's was narrow enough to force one into single file, its windows stained with colours that morning light could not quite animate. The glass looked tired, as if centuries of sermons and disputes had dimmed it. Helena Forsyth's rooms were at the far end, facing the chapel. When I first stepped across the flagstones, my shoes gave a hollow echo that lingered longer than seemed polite. Lewis walked beside me, his tone brisk, almost eager to supply me with facts. Female fellow, found late last night, collapsed in her chair. Empty glass on the floor, decanter broken, shards swept to one side by the porter before the college doctor arrived. Officially, heart failure aggravated by alcohol. Unofficially, people were already whispering. I asked if she had been alone. He said yes, as far as anyone knew. And that was the problem with Oxford. No one ever knew for certain, but everyone was certain they did. The room itself was smaller than I expected for a fellow. Shelves of books lined the walls, the smell of old paper mixed with something sharper, a trace of perfume perhaps, or cleaning fluid. The curtains were half drawn, leaving the space in an undecided twilight. On the desk, the usual paraphernalia of a scholar, notes in untidy heaps, fountain pens, a cracked dictionary with its spine held by tape. I bent towards the hearthrug where the porter said the decanter had shattered. A few fragments of green glass remained, sharp as winter frost. I touched one with my boot, shifting it slightly. The mark beneath suggested it had fallen not directly from her hand, but at an angle, almost placed rather than dropped. Lewis noticed my frown and asked if something was wrong. Nothing, I said, except the neatness of accidents. On the arm of the chair lay yesterday's newspaper folded at the crossword. I could not resist. 2 clues were unfinished. One, a simple anagram any undergraduate could have managed. The other, 7 letters again, the same structure I had circled in my own paper earlier that morning. Etched in glass, the truth survives. Coincidence, perhaps, but I have never trusted coincidence, sir. Lewis muttered about the cause of death being alcohol mixed with sleeping pills. Too much wine at high table, he suggested. Perhaps she returned, poured herself another, forgot what she had taken. A tragic accident. His tone made it clear the chief superintendent would prefer that version. Less paperwork, less embarrassment for the college. I wandered towards the window. The stained glass was unusual. Modern, I thought, inserted sometime in the last century. A Latin inscription curved along the bottom, neat but faintly wrong, as though the stonemason had borrowed his grammar from a dictionary of misprints. I read it once, then again, slower. It jarred. Misquotation is often more revealing than accuracy. Behind me, Lewis cleared his throat. He had found a letter on the mantel, addressed but unsent. I read only the first line. It spoke of secrecy, of something too fragile to be spoken aloud. The rest was lost beneath a smear of ink, as if she had changed her mind mid-sentence. We left the room in silence, the porter locking it behind us. The corridor was colder than before, and the glass windows threw patches of coloured light onto the stone floor, like clues scattered without sequence. Lewis said quietly that he saw no crime here. Neither, I replied, did I, not yet. But even as I spoke, my eyes lingered on that flawed Latin, on the unfinished crossword, on the memory of a glass placed rather than broken. Small details, perhaps, but I have always found that the truth survives less in declarations than in margins, in the quiet persistence of error. By the time we stepped into the quad, the bells were sounding again. They seemed to me less like a call to prayer than a reminder of the hour that had passed, and the hour that would follow, whether or not we learned anything more. The gallery at St. Etheldreda's felt like a corridor pretending to be a chapel. Oil-dark faces hovered in gilt, wax lingering. Lewis and I moved along creaking boards, while October light rubbed its hands on the stained glass. The porter had said the portraits calmed the fellows. I doubted it. I paused beneath a Jacobean warden with lace-like rhyme. The motto on his plaque carried a Latin smooth from polishing. I murmured it, and felt the same fractional discord that had irritated me in Helena's corridor window. Not wrong enough for complaint, not right enough for peace. Oxford delights in that interval between. Professor Godwin joined us from a side door, scarf too red for his complexion. He proposed a tour and supplied it, as if the college would be improved by his commentary. Benefactions, schisms, a manuscript pawned to mend a roof. He rehearsed them gently. I asked whether he had seen Helena at dinner. He said she had sent word of a tutorial. He had missed her. The wine was dull without her arguments. He looked at his shoes when he said it. He added that Julia Latham had seemed fatigued, and that mathematics or love might be responsible. We stopped at a Victorian lady inexplicably dressed in academic robes. Godwin called it allegory, a benefactress imagined as a don. The frame dated 1869. Across her shoulders the painter had laid a hood of scientific blue no Oxford graduate would have worn then. Allegory, Godwin repeated, forgiving the anachronism with a smile that asked me to do the same. Painters are careless historians, I said. He replied that historians are careless painters. We agreed on carelessness. The bursar came towards us carrying a ledger like a devotional book. Caro had the unblinking air of a man for whom transparency is a sacrament. Finances were sound, he said. Rumors were inefficient. Concerning the decanter in Helena's rooms, he understood a servant had been unfortunate. He did not ask which servant. He did not inquire whether shards had been gathered before or after the college doctor attended. People who manage numbers dislike splinters. In a dim alcove hung a portrait of a young scholar with a jasmine at his lapel, the flower painted with needless fidelity. The air remembered the perfume in Helena's study. So did I. A brass plate recorded the sitter's bequest. Funds for a modern window erected in gratitude after a slander was dispelled. The date matched the glass whose Latin troubled me. Gratitude is a solvent more powerful than acid. Clara Jameson arrived last, wind-stung and impatient with her hair. She said the gallery quieted her. She stood too long before a miniature of a woman holding a half-open letter, as though listening for handwriting. Helena liked the portraits that appeared to listen, Clara said, because listening is rarer than genius. Then she laughed, and the laugh looked borrowed. She added that Julia had called the place a menagerie of expensive ghosts. Lewis watched her as if the line might belong to Clara. A small arithmetic settled then, a sum in the margin. Downstairs the porter had let my eye stray across his register. Julia's name in tidy slope before the hour Godwin placed her at high table. The ink was unblotted. Either the porter had written a polite fiction, or someone's recollection preferred the taste of order to the texture of time. Between the anachronistic hood, the donor's window, and the jasmine that insisted on memory, the gallery proposed a pattern. We ended before a blank square reserved for future benefactors. Godwin folded his scarf and said, "Memory must be invested carefully." I told him the college's painters had been spending it too freely. He laughed because civility required it. The glass laid geometry on the floor, a pattern one could step through without counting, and still it would number every step we took. Helena's study had the hush of a room unwilling to admit interruption. Dust motes swam in the half-light, drifting above the desk where papers lay as though they had been considered, set aside, reconsidered, and left unresolved. I have never trusted tidy desks. The untidy ones tell truer stories. Lewis had been the first to open the lower drawer. He drew out a sheaf of bills, a folded timetable, a half-empty packet of cigarettes. Then, almost as an afterthought, he lifted a sealed envelope that bore faint signs of tampering. The gum uneven, the edges brittle. He placed it before me, his expression caught between curiosity and reluctance. I ran my finger across the flap. It had been opened once, resealed with water, and done poorly. The handwriting inside, cramped and angular, resisted haste. I read the words without speaking, though they seemed to whisper themselves aloud. A warning, oblique yet unmistakable. Say nothing or the glass will shatter. No signature, no date. Only that one unsettling line. Lewis muttered that it was probably a student prank. He had a way of dismissing ambiguity that irritated me as much as it reassured him. I said nothing. I folded the letter again and laid it flat upon the blotter. On the sill stood a pot of ink, congealed at the edges, and beside it a pen whose nib bore a faint green stain, as if its owner had corrected something in haste. There was a crossword folded beneath the blotter. Yesterday's Times smudged, nearly complete. Only 2 clues had been left blank. One of them, that same line I had already circled in my own copy. Etched in glass, the truth survives. 7 letters. To find the same absence in 2 different papers was either coincidence or insistence. I leaned towards insistence. Lewis, restless, asked if I thought Helena had enemies. Everyone has enemies, I replied, though most disguise themselves as friends. He smiled awkwardly, unsure if I meant him to hear an accusation. The rain had begun again outside, striking the panes with a rhythm that reminded me of a metronome, time keeping pace with investigation, steady, pitiless. I walked to the bookcase, running my hand along the spines. Theology, poetry, and mathematics lived together here in reluctant companionship. A slim volume of Ovid lay wedged between 2 commentaries, its margins filled with Helena's handwriting, quick and impatient. I noted that one of the misquoted lines from the stained glass had been underlined, a slip of the mason or a choice of the scholar. Lewis said quietly that we ought to pass the letter to forensics. I told him we would, but not before I had read it twice more, perhaps thrice. Warnings are like music. They alter in tone with each rehearsal. The first reading is shock, the second recognition, the third something close to comprehension. Only close. The porter tapped at the door then, apologetic. He wished to know whether the police would remain long, as the master disliked disruption. I told him truth preferred disruption to silence. He did not answer, only shuffled his feet, and Lewis dismissed him with a nod. The room seemed colder when he had gone, as though air had been allowed to escape. I sat at the desk, tracing the crack in the wood where a heavy paperweight had once struck. She must have sat here too the day she unfolded that letter, her hand resting where mine now rested, her pulse quickening perhaps, her mind calculating how much she could tell and how much must remain unsaid. There was a faint indentation on the blotter, the ghost of words written on a sheet now gone. I tilted it towards the light, but the marks would not reveal themselves. Still I felt them pressing through, absent words, absent explanations. Lewis spoke again, saying that the pathologist's report would satisfy the superintendent, that alcohol and sedatives were enough to close the matter. I told him accidents were sometimes composed with too much artistry to be believed. He sighed, accustomed to my reluctance for closure. When we left the study at last, the envelope lay once more in the drawer, but not before I had committed its single sentence to memory. A warning is seldom intended for its recipient alone. Often it waits patient for another reader. That night I carried the crossword with me, folded in my pocket, the clue still unanswered. Truth in glass, 7 letters. I repeated them like a prayer or a curse, and neither gave me comfort. Rain stitched the quadrangle into a single grey fabric, the cloister carrying the thin sound of drops, as if the stone were remembering. I walked beneath the arches with Lewis at a distance. St. Etheldreda's dislikes uncertainty. It prefers tradition, uncertainty allowed to harden. I found Professor Godwin under a leaking gargoyle, He said the college had survived worse scandals, whispered. Helena had been erratic, always glancing at the chapel window as though it owed her an apology. She missed high table for a feverish student, he said. I asked for the name. He said it was not important. Names are always important. People tire of carrying them. In the buttery, the bursar, Caro, arranged keys with care. Sealed bottles had been counted. None were missing. The servant who swept the glass had been reprimanded. He looked at my shoes and offered a cloth. I told him my shoes had survived sterner weather than Oxford. Julia Latham passed holding a notebook. She wondered if we had finished with the corridor. The light, she said, was ideal. She spoke as if sentences carried proofs. Where had she been between Vespers and 9? Walking the river until the bells lost count, she said. Would Helena's death end the gossips or feed them? Both, I told her. Clara Jameson arrived late, cheeks pink from cold. Her canvas bag should have been heavy, yet did not pull on her shoulder. Helena had lately been absent, even in company, she said. The college could be unkind to women who remembered too well. Would the police want diaries? Eventually, I said. She did not offer them. Back in the corridor, rain lightened. Puddles mirrored the window's colors. Latin shone crookedly in water. On the sill lay a pale crescent of chalk, almost erased by damp. I touched it with a fingertip and thought of the porter's register, the slope of Julia's signature at an hour that placed her at high table. Chalk suggested blackboard. Blackboard the mathematicians, and the time suggested something else. A tutorial claimed, a dinner missed, an alibi rehearsed. The chapel door muttered, and Godwin returned, apologizing to the weather the way older men do to women. Helena had asked about the donor of the modern window, he recalled, the grateful scholar whose jasmine scented the gallery portrait. She wished to correct the Latin, perhaps, but gratitude is rarely edited without a fee. Lewis asked, not without weariness, whether I suspected murder or merely manners. Manners, I said, are often murder rehearsed. He said the pathologist still liked sedatives. I said the letter in the drawer liked threats, and the decanter liked to be placed, not dropped. The servant who swept the shards spoke in a voice like wet matches. The room smelled of wine, not spirits. A clean square on the desk suggested a long familiar book gone astray. A missing book in a college is either on loan or on trial. At the porter's lodge I studied the register book. A visitor's name had been entered and scratched out, leaving the faintest trench in the paper. The initial beneath the scar resembled a J or an L. It preferred indeterminacy. The time would have placed a stranger in Helena's corridor 5 minutes before Compline. Was scratching out common? Rarer than truth, he said. Dusk arrived before it was due. Windows deepened into stubborn flames. The city leaned closer, the libraries tightening their breath, the river composing another secret. I told Lewis we would need the diaries, the servant's timetable, the buttery's key ledger, and the master's patience. He asked what I hoped to find. Fair sentence corrected in the wrong hand. A memory pretending to be a rule. A fragment of glass that contradicted its fall. When we parted, the bells restored order to the hour. I stood beneath the cloister and listened to water escape the gutters. Somewhere jasmine hung in the dark like an answer deferred. I thought of the crossword in my pocket and tried a new entry, palimpsest. It fitted the pattern but not the meaning, which at St. Etheldreda's is the only reliable sign that one is close. The bells kept counting. The river kept its counsel tonight. The invitation to dine at St. Etheldreda's came with a kind of formality that disguises curiosity. I was not a fellow nor ever likely to be one, yet the master extended his hand as if I might dignify the table. I accepted. Curiosity has always been my least respectable virtue. High table was an affair of shadows and candles, silver catching light as though reluctant. The grace, Latin and prolonged, was delivered by a young chaplain whose voice trembled with piety or nerves. It was hard to distinguish. I have always distrusted prayers that end before the appetite begins. The wine was poured with ceremony, dark and heavy. Its surface held a suggestion of secrecy. Across from me, Julia Latham sat, her gaze diverted towards the windows, as though the night offered more interest than the company. The bursar spoke in numbers even when discussing the weather, while Godwin interrupted with anecdotes that had outlived their witnesses. Clara Jameson was the only one who appeared uneasy, her hand restless at the stem of her glass, as though she might flee before the pudding. Conversation floated above the food, with the buoyancy of gossip disguised as scholarship. Someone remarked that Helena had entertained students more warmly than was strictly professional. The word entertained was emphasized. I did not reply, but I noticed Julia's lips tighten, a gesture of disdain or denial. Between courses, a servant dropped a glass. The sound of its breaking shivered through the hall, echoing longer than it should. Shards scattered across the flagstones like punctuation marks in a text too obscure to read. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and for a moment it seemed the meal itself might collapse. Then the master laughed too loudly, and the room agreed to continue. My own thoughts did not continue. They returned to Helena's study, the decanter shattered, the fragments brushed aside with the same unconvincing neatness. The echo of the glass in the hall became inseparable from that other echo. Coincidence may be tolerated once, twice it demands suspicion. Later the port circled, heavy, sweet, forgiving. Godwin leaned towards me, muttering that Helena had once challenged his translation of Ovid. He laughed, but it was not amusement. He asked whether I had seen her last letter to the council. I told him I had not. He replied that he had heard rumors of irregularities, always rumors, never facts. Clara, perhaps to divert attention, inquired about my interest in crosswords. I told her I had no interests, only obsessions. She smiled at that, though her smile was weary as though rehearsed. She mentioned that Helena solved the crossword religiously, even when she could not sleep. The master interjected, saying puzzles wasted intellect that might be spent on research. I asked if he had ever solved one himself. He admitted he had not. Then he spoke of the window in the cloister, of its beauty, its benefactor, its gratitude carved into glass. His tone suggested the window mattered more than the woman who had stared at it. I tasted the wine again. Strong, but with a faint bitterness at the back of the tongue. I asked the steward its origin. He told me Spain, a gift from a former fellow. Helena's glass, I thought, had not come from Spain. When the meal ended, I stepped out into the quad. Rain had stopped, leaving the stones glistening under lanterns. I lit a cigarette and stood alone. My mind returned to the perfume in Helena's room, the faint jasmine no one had mentioned. There had been no bottle. Perfume is always purchased for another. Lewis found me there. He said quietly that he disliked these dinners. Too much talking, not enough saying. I agreed. He asked what I had learned. Only that glass never breaks by accident, I told him. He frowned but did not press. The bells of the chapel began to strike the hour. Their sound folded the evening closed, yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was a question waiting. Lewis had been rehearsing his argument all morning. I could hear it in the rhythm of his footsteps as we crossed the quad together. Steady but pressing forward, as though truth might be reached if only we walked briskly enough. He spoke of money, of ledgers discovered in the bursary, figures altered, balances massaged into silence. Helena, he said, must have seen through the deception. She had always been precise. The bursar, Caro, had the motive, the opportunity, and the desperation. He laid it all out like a proof, his voice rising slightly with conviction. Fraud concealed beneath respectable accounts, a fellow who threatened exposure, a glass poured to hush her forever. I listened without interruption. The air smelled of rain held back, the stones slick with anticipation. In the porter's lodge the register lay open again. Lewis tapped a date with his finger triumphantly. Caro's initials, logged at the very hour Helena was last seen alive. He told me it was almost too neat and smiled as though the neatness pleased him. For him the puzzle was complete. For me, it was only beginning. We questioned Caro in his office, the shelves lined with bound accounts whose spines gleamed with a confidence no human voice could rival. He denied nothing because he confessed nothing. The ledgers, he said, were complex. Helena often challenged his arithmetic, and she was not always right. He admitted irritation, but not malice. When pressed, he produced receipts, each dull with accuracy. They smelled of ink and boredom. Lewis whispered later that guilt often hides behind pedantry. I did not disagree, but guilt also hides behind carelessness, and Caro was not careless. Back in my room that night, I unfolded the crossword again. The 7-letter clue etched in glass, "The Truth Survives," stared up with the same defiance. I tried Caro's name. It did not fit. I tried fraud. Too short, embezzled, too long. The answer resisted, stubborn as ever. I drank another measure of whiskey and considered whether the clue belonged not to a crossword but to the case itself. Words that refused to fit were often words misplaced. Lewis telephoned the next morning, impatient. He said we had enough for a report, that the superintendent would be satisfied with embezzlement uncovered and silence preserved. A fellow dead, a bursar ruined, neat, efficient, economical. I told him not to rush the funeral. He asked why, because I said, "The dead dislike simplicity." He laughed, thinking me sardonic. Yet I could not shake the memory of the glass on Helena's floor, the way it had lain angled, as though placed there by a hand unwilling to make noise. Nor could I forget the perfume in the air, jasmine faint as memory. Caro wore no perfume. Caro dined on order, not on secrecy. That evening I walked the cloister again, my steps counting the stained glass panels like bars in a score. The misquoted Latin line glimmered back, wrong and yet deliberate. I wondered if Helena had noticed, if she had written her letter because of it, and if so, what had Caro to do with Latin, with glass, with jasmine? The solution Lewis offered would have satisfied anyone else. It carried the comfort of numbers aligning, motives declared, and suspects conveniently flawed. But it satisfied me no more than a crossword filled with guesses. You can shade in the squares, but the words beneath remain unearned. I stood there until the bells struck 9, their sound hollow against the stone. The truth was not in Caro's ledger, nor in Lewis's certainty, nor in the superintendent's hunger for closure. It was somewhere in the margins, in the faint chalk on a sill, the altered quotation, the perfume without a bottle. False solutions are seductive. They promise rest. Yet rest was the one thing this case denied me. The archive at St. Etheldreda's was kept in the oldest part of the library, where the stones sweated faintly in winter, and the air carried the stillness of withheld breath. Dust lay on the ledgers like fine snow, undisturbed, fragile. I have always preferred such places to courtrooms. Truth, when it survives at all, is better hidden in paper than in people. It was a porter, half apologetic, who suggested I might find what I wanted there. He claimed Helena had spent hours in the archive during the last term, poring over the college's photographs and records. She seemed to be searching for something that wasn't there, he said. His tone implied that women in libraries were always searching for something that wasn't there. Lewis followed me reluctantly down the narrow staircase. He coughed at the dust and asked whether I thought this was worth the trouble. I told him trouble was the only reliable compass. He muttered that he preferred maps. In a wooden drawer under layers of forgotten matriculation cards, I found what Helena must have seen. A photograph stiff with age, curling at the edges. A summer garden party, the kind Oxford arranges for itself each year with minor variations of champagne and straw hats. Faces tilted towards the camera, some smiling, others feigning seriousness. And there, among them, Helena younger, her expression neither of delight nor disdain but something in between. Beside her, Julia Latham, though Julia had told me once that she had not met Helena until a year later. It is a peculiar sensation to hold in one's hand the proof of a lie so gently told. The photograph bore a date scrawled in fountain pen, unmistakable. The discrepancy was not of memory, but of intention. Clara Jameson appeared too, at the edge of the frame, younger still. Her gaze not on the camera, but on her sister, a gaze of admiration sharpened by envy. Lewis leaned over my shoulder. He said perhaps the date was wrong, that photographers mislabel things, that people misremember. He wanted reassurance, but reassurance was precisely what the photograph denied. I noticed Helena's hand. It rested lightly on Julia's arm, not with intimacy, but with possession. The gesture, half concealed by the edge of a straw hat, told more than words. A hand that lingers is rarely casual. There was also a small detail at the bottom corner, a signature in pencil, almost erased. Not the photographer's, but someone else's, as though the picture had been marked for a reason later regretted. Only the first letter remained clear, a J perhaps, or an L. Both would have sufficed. Lewis said nothing further. He preferred to think of motive in terms of money. I preferred to think of motive in terms of memory, which is cheaper and crueler. I returned the photograph to the drawer, but left it slightly out of order, so that it might disturb the next hand that searched there. Disturbance is often more revealing than discovery. When we emerged from the archive, the evening light was already fading. Rain tapped against the high windows, polite but insistent. I paused at the threshold, considering the photograph again in my mind, and the way Julia's denial had seemed too polished. I thought of Helena's crossword left unfinished, the truth surviving in glass. Photographs, too, are a kind of glass, trapping a moment that resists correction. As we walked across the quad, Lewis asked what I intended to do with the knowledge. Nothing, I told him, not yet. He asked why. Because truth, like wine, requires time to breathe. That night I placed the memory of the photograph beside the unanswered crossword clue. Both remained incomplete. Both insisted on patience. I drank slowly, listening to the bells in the distance, and imagined Helena's hand resting on Julia's arm. The gesture lingering like a question, I had no wish to answer too quickly. It was the window that returned to me, as it always had, patient as an unanswered question. The cloister at St. Etheldrada's was quiet that evening, the rain having exhausted itself into a damp stillness. I walked beneath the arches alone, Lewis occupied with paperwork he trusted more than impressions. I stopped before the glass, my eyes adjusting to the dim light that leaked from the chapel. The Latin inscription curved neatly across the lower panel, letters cut with the confidence of permanence. Yet permanence is a trick. Even stone misremembers. I had read Ovid enough to know the line was wrong. Not entirely, only enough to trouble the ear. An altered tense, a missing particle, a slight fracture in the symmetry. The sort of mistake a mason might make if he relied on memory rather than manuscript, or the sort of change a scholar might request for reasons of her own. I leaned against the sill. The glass carried the faint scent of damp chalk. The porter had told me once that Helena paused here often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara at her side. What did she see in the colors, I wondered, that others overlooked? Back in my rooms later, I searched through an old copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Loeb edition with its facing translation, margin smudged from student days. I traced the line, the true line, unaltered. Etched in glass, the truth survives. The college version had shifted the verb, turning survival into silence. A small change, yet one that converted endurance into secrecy. Lewis telephoned to remind me of our appointment with the superintendent. He said we had enough for closure. Helena had discovered financial irregularities. Caro silenced her, the evidence in the ledgers sufficient. I asked him whether truth survived in numbers. He said numbers never lied. I told him people who used them did. He sighed, unused to my reluctance for conclusion. The crossword remained folded in my pocket. I spread it across the desk, tracing the familiar clue. 7 letters. Glass truth survival. I wrote silence. It fit the spaces, yet it betrayed the clue. Survival and silence are not the same. They only resemble each other in the dark. The following morning I returned to the archive. The photograph I had found earlier continued to trouble me. Julia's denial of acquaintance, the date that insisted otherwise, Helena's hand resting lightly on her arm. I laid the photograph beside a record of bequests. There, in a careful clerk's hand, I saw the donor's name. A long-dead fellow accused once of dishonor, acquitted by evidence no longer extant. His gratitude had been purchased with the window. Gratitude or guilt I could not tell, but the alteration in the inscription must have been deliberate, echoing a history the college preferred to half conceal. Clara found me in the library. She asked if I had discovered anything. Her eyes avoided mine, straying instead to the photograph still on the table. She said Helena cared too much for symbols, for the way words reflected upon glass or paper. She said she herself had never understood it. I noticed her hand tremble slightly when she touched the edge of the frame. She left before I could reply. Later, Lewis remarked that Clara seemed too involved for a grieving sister. He suspected obsession. I told him obsession was common in Oxford, rarer elsewhere. What troubled me more was her insistence that she did not understand Helena's fascination with inscriptions. When I'd already seen her gazing too long at a miniature in the gallery, a woman holding a letter half open. Some gestures confess more than words. As evening fell, I stood again before the window. The misquoted line glowed faintly in the failing light. A mistake carved in glass is no mistake at all. It is an assertion disguised as error, and Helena had read it as such. She had known its meaning, perhaps even intended to expose it. The bells began their slow count of the hour. I felt then, though I could not yet prove it, that Helena's death was less about money than about memory, less about ledgers than about lines misquoted, altered to conceal or to accuse. I walked away from the cloister with the clue still unanswered, the photograph still burning in my pocket, and the faint conviction that the truth was waiting, not in the ledger's columns but in the altered grammar of glass. The trouble with Oxford is not that it lies, but that it tells the truth too beautifully. I sat with Julia Latham in her rooms that evening, the rain leaning against the mullioned panes as if it wanted admission. She offered tea, which I declined, preferring whiskey I had brought myself. She smiled faintly at the impropriety. Lewis had insisted we question her again. He was certain now that jealousy, sharpened by years of silence, had pushed Julia to poison Helena. He said the photograph in the archive proved intimacy, and her denial of it betrayed motive. He repeated it often enough that even I felt the temptation to agree. Julia leaned back in her chair, her notebook closed on the desk. She spoke evenly, too evenly, of her friendship with Helena. How admiration soured into argument, how the college whispered and the whispers hardened into judgments. She admitted she envied Helena's charm, her ability to draw students and colleagues alike into orbit. But envy is common currency in Oxford. It seldom purchases death. Still, there was something in the way she avoided the word love, replacing it with companionship, with respect, with a catalogue of abstractions that tasted of evasion. Lewis pressed her. She did not flinch. She said very quietly that she had wished Helena alive, not dead. For Helena's absence only multiplied suspicion. It was the sort of truth that wears the costume of defense. When we left, Lewis muttered that her calmness was unnatural. Innocent people panic. I told him guilty people do too. He scowled, dissatisfied with paradox. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword once more. Etched in glass, the truth survives. Silence had been my earlier answer. Now I wrote conceal. 7 letters. It fitted, and for a moment I believed it. Truth concealed, Helena silenced, Julia jealous. It was a narrative so neat it almost sang. Almost. I poured another measure of whiskey and recalled the perfume in Helena's room. Jasmine, unmistakable. I had asked Julia once what fragrance she wore. She said none, that she disliked it. The memory surfaced now with unwelcome clarity. Julia was too austere for perfume, too deliberate. The scent belonged to someone else. The false solution unraveled in my hands. If Julia had poisoned Helena, She had done so without leaving a trace of herself in the room. Yet there, woven into the air, had been a presence more intimate than handwriting. Perfume is not forgotten by a room, and Helena's study had remembered. The next morning I walked across the quad alone. The cloister was slick with rain, the stained glass glimmering weakly. I thought again of the misquoted line, survival turned into silence, endurance altered into concealment. Julia's denial, the photograph's evidence, Helena's unfinished crossword, all pointed in one direction. Yet the jasmine pulled me back, tugging gently at the sleeve. Louis caught up with me, impatient. He said the superintendent would be pleased to proceed against Julia. Motive clear, opportunity plausible, evidence circumstantial, but sufficient. I asked him whether sufficiency ever resembled truth. He said it did often enough for court. I walked on without answering. In the stillness of the chapel I sat for a while, the faint scent of candle wax mingling with damp stone. False solutions bring a kind of peace temporary, seductive. They let the weary sleep, the administrators sigh with relief, the constables tick their boxes, but they leave the crossword unsolved, the clue staring back, stubborn, waiting. I lit a cigarette outside and watched the smoke curl against the rain. Julia might have lied, but her lies lacked the perfume of presence. The truth lingered elsewhere, patient, perfumed, concealed within the silence of another. The cloister belonged to a weatherless hour when neither rain nor darkness claimed authority. I stood beneath the window again, its colors patient as old bruises. The Latin mended into mischief. Whoever altered the line had preferred secrecy to endurance. That preference, like a watermark, ran through the college. Clara found me there. Footsteps first, then Jasmine. Then the slight pause of someone rehearsing composure. "The porter said you were wandering," she said. I told her wandering and thinking were the same pastime here. She asked if the misquotation mattered. I said it mattered to the kind of person who misquotes on purpose. We went to Helena's rooms without speaking further. I set the resealed letter on the blotter between us and read the single sentence once more. "Say nothing or the glass will shatter." She called it melodrama. I said melodrama is only truth with a stage manager. On the mantel waited the lobe, margins busy with Helena's impatience. Beside it, I placed a copy of the bequest clause from the archive. The window's grammar had hidden a simple key. Following the initial letters cut across the panes led to a paragraph in Helena's draft will. Most of the estate for conservation of the glass, the residue for Clara. A modest list of personal effects. A sentiment dangerous to family arithmetic. Clara's face altered without moving. Promises had been made, she said, the sort that arrive between midnight and morning and do not survive breakfast. The college eats everything, she said. I asked whether it had eaten her as well. She touched the chair back, steadying the room rather than herself. Louis, I knew, would have fetched forms and witnesses. I preferred the room as it was, listening. I told her the crossword had troubled me for days. Etched in glass, the truth survives. She said truth survives most comfortably when no one insists on naming it. Then the jasmine shifted again, and the room remembered a different evening. I asked whether she wore the perfume in Helena's rooms. She asked if perfume could convict. Memory convicts more often than fingerprints, I said, if only of the heart. She looked at the window as if it were a jury. Her words arrived not as confession but as commentary, a footnote to a page she would not turn. Helena meant to sign after term. Clara begged delay. There had been wine. There had been laughter mistaken for forgiveness. The decanter lifted with the practiced grace of someone who has cleared tables, poured for guests, kept quiet. A little powder. A silence considered merciful. The glass set down rather than dropped so the room would not cry out. I let the silence lengthen. She asked whether the college would preserve the window more fiercely than it would pity her. The college preserves what cannot contradict it, I said. People oblige inconsistently. The bells counted an hour that no one owned. Could there be mercy if there had been love? Mercy and love are cousins who seldom write, I said. and wished I had not been honest. Lewis arrived with the briskness of procedure. He spoke carefully. She answered carefully. Care assembled the scene. Statements were taken. Dates written. The porter's register remembered what it had been told to forget. Nothing loud occurred. After they had gone, I stayed. The study returned to its half-light, paper smelling of dust. I opened the crossword and gave the clue its due. 7 letters. The setter hinted at durability. The case spoke of revision. I wrote palimpsest and felt the answer sit down, not triumphant, merely sufficient. Truth survives by being rewritten. Glass survives by being mended. Love survives as scent remembered by a room. On the floor, a crescent shard shone where the rug had not reached. It gathered lamp glow and offered it back reluctantly, as if light itself were a question. I pocketed nothing. Evidence is not improved by nostalgia. When I stepped into the cloister, the misquoted line glowed with the arrogance of a solved clue. It would keep shining long after the papers were filed. Oxford is diligent with its errors. It curates them and explains them to visitors. Grief receives fewer labels. The superintendent accepted the statement with a relief that looked like virtue. Lewis stood beside him, dutiful, tired, pleased to have the final paragraph written. Clara had spoken with a calm that convinced no one and everyone. She had not asked for mercy. She had asked for understanding, rarer and less useful. Paperwork began its digestion. I left them to it. Outside, the quad contained a small wind. I walked the cloister to the window again, not for evidence, but for company. The misquoted line glowed cautiously. Even truth seemed tentative. Oxford has a schedule for everything except the heart. Lewis found me there and said we had done what could be done. He asked if I was satisfied. Satisfaction is a dish I never order, I told him. He said the crown would be kinder for confession, and I said the crown is only a headpiece for paperwork. He smiled and went to shepherd forms towards signatures. In Helena's rooms the air had thinned of jasmine. The lobe lay closed, the blotter blank, the desk arranged too carefully by an anonymous hand. I sat in her chair and listened to the silence learning her shape. The truth, such as it was, had been etched, not found. A will revised by glass, a sister rearranging survival, a room remembering what people preferred to forget. On the hearthrug, a sliver of green remained. I nudged it with a fingertip and watched how it captured the lamp and surrendered it reluctantly. You could reconstruct a goblet from enough fragments, a life from enough letters, but neither would hold wine again. That is the quiet obscenity of our work. Nothing we repair remains what it was. I unfolded the crossword one last time. The 7-letter burden met me without ceremony. Palimpsest had pleased me yesterday. Tonight it felt exact. I inked it gently, a courtesy to a finished conversation. Other clues revealed themselves with docility, as if the setter, granted attention at last, would make amends. I left one space blank, the small defiance that keeps a man honest. The master requested a word and received a silence. He muttered about reputation, donors, the delicate ecology of tradition. I told him the ecology would survive. It always does. He asked whether I believed the college good. I replied that institutions are like libraries. They protect what they catalogue and forget what they misfile. He stared at the window and called it beautiful. Beauty, I said, is the most persuasive alibi. Evening assembled itself. At last students crossed the quad. A porter shut a door with priestly care. A piano practiced scales. I paused at the gate and counted what remained. The bursar exonerated by tedium, the photograph refusing Julia her denial, Clara's voice steady where her hands were not, the servant's damp match of memory, the window's grammar choosing secrecy. Lewis called from the lodge and asked whether I'd join him at the pub. I said another night. He said the case would do without me now. That, I told him, was why I needed a walk. He let me go with the shake of the head he keeps for my stubbornness. I took the long route by the river. The Cherwell moved without interest. I thought of Helena's hand on an arm in a photograph, of love that demanded a smaller life than anyone deserved. Mercy arrives too late here. Understanding later still. I am not angry with Clara. I reserve anger for simpler crimes, Rain returned. I stood on the bridge until the bells began. The sound reached across water and stone, and the part of the mind that listens when drink has gone quiet. Cases end. Stories do not. I turned for home with the crossword in my pocket, one square left blank to admit the things glass cannot hold. In Oxford, answers weather handsomely, but questions keep their youth. The lamps made aureoles on the wet road. I walked through them slowly, like a man passing discreetly under modest halos, and felt for a moment only that the city forgave me nothing and needed nothing from me in return.